In the early years of World War II, the Third Reich fought with a terrifying efficiency that masked a fatal secret. It was fighting a partial war. While the world watched newsreels of blitzkrieg victories, the German economy was still operating on a peacetime footing, with factories producing consumer goods and women staying home rather than working in munitions plants. It wasn't until the walls began to close and that the Nazi leadership attempted to mobilize the full strength of a nation, a decision that would ultimately prove to be a catastrophic case of too little, too late. If you are fascinated by the hidden economic and strategic failures that underpin great military defeats, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into history. To understand why the final strategy failed, we must look at the illusion of 1942. At the height of its power, Germany controlled a continent, yet its tank production was lower than that of Great Britain. Adolf Hitler, fearful of repeating the domestic unrest of World War I, refused to impose strict rationing or total labor conscription on the German populace. He wanted to maintain the facade that life was normal, that the war was a distant colonial expedition. This hesitation allowed the Allies, specifically the United States and the Soviet Union, to build an insurmountable lead in industrial output. By the time Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, took control and began to rationalize production, the gap was already widening. The turning point came with Joseph Goebbels' famous Total War speech at the Sportpalast in February 1943. He shouted to a fanatical crowd, asking if they wanted a war more total and radical than anything we could imagine. The crowd screamed yes, but the machinery of the state was slow to respond. It wasn't until the summer of 1944, after the Allies had landed in Normandy and the Soviets had crushed Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, that the German leadership truly panicked. Only then did they attempt to implement the strategy that should have been in place years earlier, the total mobilization of every scrap of resource, human and material, for the defense of the Reich. This late-stage strategy relied on a delusion, the belief that willpower could overcome logistics. In late 1944, German factories, moved underground to avoid Allied bombing, actually achieved their highest production numbers of the entire war. They were churning out thousands of fighter planes and tanks. On paper, it looked like a miracle, but in reality it was a logistical ghost town. The strategy ignored the fact that a tank is useless without fuel, and a fighter plane is a paperweight without a trained pilot. The Allies had destroyed the synthetic oil plants. The Luftwaffe training program had collapsed. Germany was producing weapons for an army that could no longer move and an air force that could no longer fly. The tragedy of this delay was that it extended the war without altering its outcome. Had the total war economy been fully activated in 1942, Germany might have been able to force a stalemate in the East or repel the invasion in the West. By implementing it in 1944, all the leadership achieved was to feed more men and machines into a grinder that had already jammed. They stripped the factories of skilled workers to send them to the front lines, ensuring that the quality of the weapons plummeted just as the quantity rose. Sabotage by forced laborers became rampant. Tanks arrived at the front with faulty transmissions and guns that hadn't been sighted. Furthermore, this desperate scramble for resources led to a cannibalization of the German infrastructure. The railway network, the lifeline of the nation, was prioritized for military traffic to such an extent that the distribution of food and coal to civilians began to collapse. The strategy of victory at all costs was rapidly morphing into a strategy of collective suicide. The leadership was no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable, driven by a fear of what would happen when the end finally came. As 1944 turned into the freezing winter of 1945, the disconnect between the strategic planning in Berlin and the reality on the front became absolute. Hitler moved imaginary divisions on maps, divisions that existed only on paper or had been reduced to a few hundred starving men. The final strategy was a strategy of numbers, devoid of context. It counted rifles, but ignored the hands that would hold them. It counted divisions, but ignored the morale of the men. It was a bureaucratic fiction designed to comfort a dictator, while outside the bunker, the world burned. As the professional army disintegrated in the East and West, the Nazi regime turned to its last, most tragic reserve, the civilians. The creation of the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, in October 1944 was a physical embodiment of a nation consuming itself. Old men and teenage boys were handed anti-tank weapons and told they could stop the Red Army. It was a criminal waste of life masquerading as a military strategy. Before we walk into the trenches with these conscripts, hit the like button to support our efforts to document the human cost of war. The Volkssturm was not part of the Wehrmacht. It was a Nazi party militia commanded by Heinrich Himmler. This distinction is vital. It meant that the professional military officers, who might have had the sense to retreat or surrender, were overruled by fanatical party officials known as Gauleiters. The decree conscripted all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 who were not already serving. In reality, the age limits were often ignored. Boys as young as 12 and men in their 70s were dragged into the ranks. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Newsreels showed gray-haired veterans of World War I standing shoulder to shoulder with members of the Hitler Youth, clutching Panzerfausts. The message was one of romantic nationalism, a grassroots uprising to defend the sacred soil of the fatherland. They invoked the spirit of 1813, when militias helped drive Napoleon out of Germany. But 1945 was not 1813. The enemy did not have muskets. They had T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and total air supremacy. The reality of the Volkssturm was pathetic and horrifying. Most units had no uniforms. They fought in their civilian clothes or old railway worker uniforms, wearing armbands to identify them as combatants. This put them in a dangerous legal gray area. If captured, the Soviets often treated them not as soldiers, but as partisans or saboteurs, leading to summary executions. They lacked rifles. Many were issued with captured Italian or Danish weapons for which there was no ammunition. Their training consisted, at best, of a few hours learning how to fire a Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon. Strategically, the deployment of the Volkssturm came far too late to matter. Had a national militia been trained and integrated into the army defenses in 1943, they might have released regular troops for the front. But throwing them into the breach in late 1944 was an act of desperation. In battles like the defense of Königsberg or Breslau, Volkssturm battalions were decimated in minutes. They were used as human speed bumps, meant to slow down the Soviet advance by a few hours. The psychological impact on the German population was devastating. Seeing their grandfathers and children marched off to die stripped away the last illusions of the regime's competence. It was clear that the state could no longer protect its people. It was now demanding that the people die to protect the state. Mothers hid their sons in attics. Deserters were hanged from lampposts by roving SS death squads with signs around their necks reading, "I betrayed the Führer." The People's Storm brought the terror of the front line directly into the German neighborhoods. Yet in some sectors, the Volkssturm fought with surprising tenacity, motivated by fear of Soviet retribution. Fueled by Goebbels' propaganda about atrocities in the East, they held out in bunkers and ruins. But this resistance ultimately worked against Germany. It encouraged the Allied commanders to use heavy artillery and aerial bombing to level towns, rather than risking infantry assaults. The fanaticism of the militia ensured the total destruction of the cities they were trying to defend. The decision to mobilize the Volkssturm was a final betrayal of the social contract between the government and the governed. It was an admission that the military strategy had failed completely. Instead of seeking a political solution to save lives, the leadership chose to weaponize the population. They armed the Hitler Youth, children who had known nothing but propaganda their entire lives, and sent them to face Sherman tanks. The tragedy of the Volkssturm is not just that it failed to change the war, but that it stole the future generation of a country that was already on its knees. While the civilians were dying in the streets, a ghost story was taking hold in the minds of the Allied High Command. Intelligence reports began to circulate about a national redoubt, an Alpine or Alpine Fortress, with a Nazi elite plan to retreat and fight a guerrilla war that could last for years. This belief, though largely a myth, had real-world consequences that distorted the final months of the war. If you want to understand how deception can be as powerful as armies, ensure you're subscribed to our channel. The idea of the Alpine Fortress was that the German army would withdraw into mountainous regions of Bavaria and Austria. There, amidst the peaks and caves, they would stockpile weapons, build underground factories, and hold out indefinitely, protected by the impassable terrain. It was a terrifying prospect for the war-weary Allies. The specter of a never-ending partisan war haunted General Eisenhower. He feared that even if Berlin fell, the war would not end. The irony is that the Alpine Fortress was largely a fabrication. There were no massive stockpiles of food. The underground factories were not ready. Hitler himself had not authorized the construction of such a fortress until it was far too late, still clinging to the delusion that he could win the war on the plains of Germany. The fortifications were mostly propaganda, spun by Goebbels and SS intelligence to frighten the Allies and keep the German people hoping for a miracle. However, the strategy of deception worked too well. It influenced Allied military movements in a way that arguably prolonged the war for the German people in the East. Eisenhower, worried about the southern redoubt, diverted resources away from the drive toward Berlin. He swung the American army south into Bavaria and Austria to cut off the retreat. This decision left Berlin to be taken solely by the Red Army. For the German leadership, this late-stage pivot to a fortress strategy was a chaotic mess. As the fronts collapsed, high-ranking Nazis began to flee south, clogging the roads with cars loaded with art, gold, and champagne. It wasn't a strategic withdrawal. It was a panic. The SS units that did arrive in the Alps found little infrastructure to support them. They were elite soldiers without a mission, stranded in the snow. The werewolf guerrilla movement was part of this final strategy. The plan was to leave behind sleeper cells of fanatical Nazis in occupied territory, to assassinate Allied officers and sabotage supply lines. Like the Alpine Fortress, Werewolf was more bark than bite. While there were isolated incidents, such as the assassination of the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, the mass uprising never materialized. The German population was too exhausted, too hungry, and too disillusioned to wage a guerrilla war. The tragedy of the Alpine Fortress myth lies in the resources it consumed in the final days. Construction battalions that should have been repairing bombed-out water mains in the cities were sent to dig tunnels in the mountains that would never be used. Trains carrying concrete were prioritized over trains carrying flour. The leadership was building a fantasy refuge, while the reality of the nation collapsed around them. Furthermore, the focus on the South meant that the northern ports and the evacuation routes for refugees fleeing the Soviets were left vulnerable. The disorganized retreat to the Alps split the remaining German forces, making it impossible to form a coherent defensive line anywhere. The strategy became a self-fulfilling prophecy of defeat, accelerating the disintegration of the Wehrmacht. When American troops finally broke into the supposed fortress in April and May 1945, they found no impregnable citadels. They found stunning mountain scenery, a few half-finished bunkers, and thousands of surrendering soldiers who just want to go home. The Alpine Fortress was a final strategic mirage of the Third Reich, a lie that fooled the world but could not save its creators. In the final weeks of the conflict, the strategy shifted from defense to pure nihilism. As it became clear that the war was lost, Adolf Hitler issued the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree, commonly known as the Nero Decree. It was an order to destroy everything: bridges, factories, dams, railroads, and communication hubs. The logic was twisted and brutal. If the German people were too weak to win the victory, they did not deserve to survive the defeat. Before we examine this act of national self-destruction, verify that you are subscribed. You won't want to miss our breakdown of the final days in the bunker. Issued on March 19, 1945, the Nero Decree was the ultimate expression of the regime's all-or-nothing ideology. Hitler argued that the Allies would find nothing but scorched earth. He wanted to ensure that post-war Germany would be an industrial wasteland, incapable of supporting the invaders or the survivors. It was a strategy not of war, but of spite. The implementation of this order fell to Gauleiters and the military commanders, but critically, it also fell to Albert Speer. Speer, the Minister of Armaments, realized that carrying out this order would mean the death sentence for the German nation. Without water pumps, coal mines, or railways, millions would die of starvation and disease in the coming winter. Speer began a dangerous game of travel and persuasion. He drove around the collapsing Reich, meeting with generals and industrial leaders, urging them to ignore Hitler's orders. He explained that the war was over and that they had a responsibility to the future of the German people. He ordered explosives to be removed from bridges. He ordered sluice gates on dams to be protected. The conflict between the official strategy of destruction and the clandestine strategy of preservation created a chaotic environment. In some towns, fanatic SS units blew up the medieval bridges that had stood for centuries, cutting off water and gas lines in the process. In others, Wehrmacht commanders handed over infrastructure intact to the Americans, knowing that their own families would need it to survive. The Nero Decree highlights the complete moral collapse of the Nazi leadership. A rational government, realizing defeat is inevitable, seeks to minimize the suffering of its people and preserve the assets needed for rebuilding. The Nazis did the opposite. They viewed the infrastructure of Germany not as the property of the people, but as the property of the party. If the party fell, the infrastructure had to fall with it. This scorched earth mentality extended to the military conduct as well. Cities were declared fortresses, Festung, and ordered to hold out to the last man, resulting in their total leveling. Breslau, for example, held out under siege for months, long after it had any strategic value. The city was pulverized, and tens of thousands of civilians died needlessly, just to prove a point about German will. The failure of the Nero Decree to be fully implemented is the only reason Germany was able to recover as quickly as it did after the war. Had Speer and others not sabotaged the order, the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, of the 1950s would have been impossible. Germany would have remained an agrarian wasteland for decades. The Nero Decree was a final proof that the regime had become a parasite on the nation it claimed to lead. The strategy wasn't about saving Germany. It was about ensuring that Germany died with Hitler. It came too late to stop the Allies, but just in time to reveal the true, hollow core of the ideology. While the ground war collapsed, the German leadership clung to one last, desperate hope, the Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. Propaganda promised that revolutionary new technologies were just around the corner, weapons so powerful they would turn the tide in a single stroke. This technological obsession was a strategy of delusion that diverted critical resources away from the weapons that were actually needed. If you enjoy learning about military technology, hit the like button and subscribe for more. The most famous of these were the V weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were indeed engineering marvels. The V-2 was the world's first ballistic missile, reaching the edge of space before crashing down on London at supersonic speeds. There was no defense against it, but strategically they were useless. They were inaccurate terror weapons. They killed civilians and blew up houses, but they couldn't hit a specific factory or troop concentration. The cost of the V-2 program was staggering. It consumed more money and resources than the Manhattan Project, the U.S. atomic bomb. Germany spent billions developing a rocket that delivered a 1-ton warhead, while they were running out of basic artillery shells. Thousands of slave laborers died building them in the underground tunnels of Dor-Mittelbau. It was a grotesque inefficiency. Had those resources been put into building jet fighters or more Panzer IV tanks in 1943, the war might have dragged on much longer. Then there was the war at sea. Admiral Donitz pinned his hopes on the Type XXI U-boat. This was the first true submarine, capable of operating almost entirely underwater with high speed and long range. It was decades ahead of Allied technology. It had silent running motors, advanced sonar, and rapid-fire torpedoes. If hundreds of Type XXIs had been prowling the Atlantic in 1943, they could have cut the lifeline to Britain. But like everything else, they came too late. By the time the Type XXI was ready for mass production in 1945, the German ports were being bombed daily. The logistical chain to build the batteries and sections was broken. Only a handful ever went on patrol. They were technological masterpieces that ended up scuttled in the harbor. The obsession with advanced technology became a trap. The Germans were constantly tinkering, constantly improving, constantly seeking the perfect weapon. They built the massive Mouse tank, a 188-ton monster that couldn't cross bridges. They built the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered fighter that dissolved its pilots in acid leaks. In contrast, the Allies focused on good enough. The American Sherman tank was inferior to a Tiger, but it worked, it was reliable, and it was available. The Soviet T 34 was rough, but it could be fixed with a hammer. The Germans were building Ferraris to fight a demolition derby against bulldozers. The wonder weapon strategy was a psychological crutch. It allowed the leadership to ignore the mathematical certainty of defeat. It gave the soldiers in the trenches a false hope to cling to. Just hold on a little longer. The officers would say, the new weapons are coming. It was a lie that bought time for the regime, but paid for it with the blood of soldiers who died waiting for a savior that never arrived. In April 1945, the Red Army encircled Berlin. The strategy of total war, the mobilization of the Volkssturm, the myths of the Alpine Fortress, and the promise of wonder weapons all converged in the burning streets of the capital. The final battle was not a strategic maneuver. It was a slaughterhouse. As we conclude this series, make sure you are subscribed to the channel for our final analysis of the war's aftermath. The Battle of Berlin was the ultimate failure of the final strategy. The city was defended by a patchwork of shattered Wehrmacht units, 4 SS volunteers, police officers, and the Volkssturm, boys from the Hitler Youth hunted tanks in the rubble. The strategic goal was non-existent. Hitler believed that if he could cause enough casualties, the unnatural alliance between the capitalists, USA/UK, and the communist USSR would break and one side would join him. It was a delusion of a man who had lost all contact with reality. The human cost of this delay was astronomical. More German civilians and soldiers died in the last 9 months of the war, from July 1944 to May 1945, than in the previous 5 years combined. The refusal to surrender, the insistence on mobilizing every last grandfather and child, turned Germany into a graveyard. The cities were pulverized. The population was flooded with millions of refugees fleeing the east, caught in the crossfire. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, the final strategy lay exposed for what it was, a crime against the German people. The strategy had achieved nothing but the total destruction of the state. There was no negotiation power. There was no Alpine redoubt. There were no miracle weapons turning the tide. There was only unconditional surrender and a country occupied by 4 foreign powers. The lesson of Germany's final strategy is a lesson in the danger of sunken cost fallacy and ideological blindness. The leadership could not accept that the gamble of 1939 had failed. Instead of cutting their losses, they doubled down and then tripled down until they were betting with the lives of 12-year-old boys. It also highlights the difference between a state that serves its people and a people forced to serve the state. A responsible government surrenders when the war is lost to save lives. The Nazi regime sacrificed the lives to save the government for just a few more weeks. The decision that Germany could never recover from wasn't a single order given in 1945. It was a decision to delay the end. The recovery of Europe took decades, but the scars of those final feudal months, the destroyed heritage, the displaced families, the empty chairs at dinner tables, lasted for generations. The strategy came too late to win the war, but it arrived just in time to ensure that the peace would begin in a desolate, starving, and broken world. Thank you for watching this detailed documentary series. If you want to understand how the Allies rebuilt this broken world, click the video on your screen about the Marshall Plan. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history.